So, epistemic trust refers to trust in the quality and reliability of information. It's a well established term, but we've recently reframed it and applied it to thinking in terms of human psychopathology. That's really what we're going to be elaborating on today. But as a bit of background, what we mean by epistemic trust in this context is a particular adaptation that human beings have to enable us to acquire knowledge in a fast and effective way from other people through having epistemic trust. The advantage of epistemic trust is that it enables us to receive information from another person without having to work out for ourselves whether it's reliable. We can take in what's told to us and accept it as part of our cultural currency. The theory is based on the idea that we have evolved an adaptation to enable us to teach and learn from one another. And this is what has made human cultural complexity possible. We can take in huge amounts of sophisticated knowledge from other people without having to work it out for ourselves. So the kind of knowledge that we're particularly interested in relation to epistemic trust in this context is knowledge about how the world works, how our culture works in particular. And so the kind of information we're referring to is often information that's not necessarily obvious in its own terms. It can be opaque in its purpose or its meaning or its logic, but it's also very useful because it's the kind of knowledge that you can reapply in other settings, so it's generalizable. And we also assume that this kind of cultural knowledge is shared by people that we cohabit in our culture with. So it's kind of shared cultural currency that enables us to navigate our social world in an effective and successful way. And epistemic trust enables us to take in that knowledge and make the most of being in our social environment. But the flip side of epistemic trust is that we do have to have some capacity to judge whether or not what we're being told is accurate. There is a need for some form of epistemic vigilance, because human social complexity does mean that some people won't always be accurate. They might be unreliable. This might be through their own lack of knowledge themselves, or it might be through their deliberate attempt to deceive. For one way or another, we do need to exercise some vigilance towards what is being communicated to us. So we've evolved the capacity for epistemic vigilance, but we also need to kind of have this sort of flip of epistemic trust. And the advantage of being in a trusting relationship with one's caregiver is that it's a shortcut to relaxing one's epistemic vigilance. We can invest epistemic trust in what other people are telling us. If someone is in a position of epistemic trust, they're open to communication. So if we're in a position of epistemic vigilance, we might not regard the information that's being transmitted to us as reliable or well-intentioned. An individual who, for whatever reason, has developed in a context in which people haven't been entirely trustworthy, perhaps through reasons of early adversity, the individual might not have learnt that it's safe to adopt a position of epistemic trust. This will be protective in that that person will have a position of epistemic vigilance against misinformation. But if it becomes a long-term adaptation, the individual will become closed down in their capacity for epistemic trust. The disadvantage of this is that they are then not able to benefit from the full richness of communication from the outside world about how to function in one's social environment. It might be difficult to take in new information that would enable oneself to become more effective and more competent in social functioning. So epistemic mistrust is a necessary adaptation, or at least epistemic vigilance is a necessary adaptation. But when it becomes entrenched as epistemic mistrust, it can lead the individual to be in a position of social disadvantage. And this is where we come to the relationship between epistemic trust and psychopathology. We suggest that individuals with high vulnerability towards psychopathology often have high levels of epistemic mistrust. They might find it hard to adapt to their social environment, to form healthy relationships based on the shared communication of knowledge, based on the idea of shared interest. In particular, this theory has been applied in the context of thinking about borderline personality disorder. So it slightly reframes it less as a personality pathology and more as a failure of communication. It's this sort of the social environment around the individual has close down that individual's capacity and openness to social communication. And as an adaptation to that, the person becomes quite epistemically closed off. And that's a sort of immediate adaptation that's quite useful, but then can lead to later vulnerabilities in terms of social relationships and benefiting from them. That's sort of the background on epistemic trust. I'd like to now just talk a little bit about a new research study that we've just set up, which quite excitingly for us is trying to explore what empirical evidence we can to support some of this thinking about epistemic trust. A lot of the work that we've done so far is quite theoretical. It's based on experimental and studies in terms of how infants learn and take in information, but we haven't really got any hard data in terms of the long-term outcomes and the relationship between epistemic trust and individual psychopathology and their social experience. So this study is really a first attempt to try and explore some of these ideas to kind of back up what we're postulating. So we've just started this new study. My co-investigators are Peter, Michal Tanzer, and Patrick Luyten. And I think Elizabeth Lee is with us today, one of our PhD students who's also working with us on this. So the study has really got two components. The first is to try and establish a questionnaire that can really assess how high or low someone's capacity for epistemic trust is. And once we've validated and set up this questionnaire, to explore how people's scoring on the epistemic trust questionnaire relates to their response to other surveys that assess their attachment status, their psychopathology, and their childhood experiences of trauma. So we're really trying to untangle and see the relationship between these processes, and to really explore whether our thinking that epistemic mistrust might be related to adversity in childhood and be associated with increased risk for mental health disorder is in fact correct. The second part of this project is to explore some of the things that we were talking about earlier, about seeing whether epistemic trust can really help us understand how people relate to the wider social questions, and in particular, whether difficulties with epistemic trust are associated with people's capacity to differentiate between fake news and real news, and whether there's a relationship between epistemic trust, mistrust, and an individual's likeliness to resort to conspiracy theory thinking. So it's sort of one, which is study one is quite a kind of individual, looking at the relationship within an individual between their epistemic trust and their other social and emotional background issues. And then the second aspect of the study is looking at how it affects the way they see the outside world, in particular, how easily or how difficult it is for them to understand the information that they're receiving from the outside world.